when I finally arrived at the point where I was willing to say yes to that question, then the embodiment, the physical embodiment of music and of voice and of expression that had characterized the first 20 years of my life was collapsed in with the next 20 years where I wasn't embodying it. I wasn't claiming these parts of myself on the outside in any way, shape, or form, but I was thinking about it and I was dreaming of it and I was visualizing it. And my heart and my soul were very much engaging with this part of myself, such that when I finally said yes, just 3 years ago, to the call, when I finally said yes in response to the question, are you willing to risk the life that you've been living for the one that calls you, for the one that you could be living? When I finally said yes, the whole universe rose to meet me because I said yes and then I took steps in the direction of that dream. I took steps in the direction of that embodiment. I laid claim to these parts of myself. So in that sense, time kind of collapsed and things started to move so quickly. And this is how I was able to move to Portugal. This is how I was able to step into a role working as the lead researcher in collaboration with a university to initiate a therapeutic sound research center in Europe, of all places.
This is my outside voice.
This is her outside
This is my outside. This is her outside voice.
Her Outside Voice is a podcast amplifying the voice of the feminine, the stories of those who embody her, and the forces that shape the choice to reclaim, express, or remain silent. Join podcast host Kristi Rogers for the very first episode of this collective memoir of the feminine, where she explains the inspiration for the podcast, lays the foundation for what you can expect as a listener of this global interview series, and shares the story of her own journey of the voice. This is my outside voice. This is her outside voice. My name is Kristi Rogers, and I am the host of this wonderful production. Today, I wanted to sort of lay some groundwork and establish a foundation for what this series is all about. And also, I felt like just to kind of contextualize the reason why this seemed like such an important topic, I'm also going to tell my own story of the voice. And it will make sense to you upon hearing it why this has been such an important mission for me to also uplift and empower others and at least hold space for those who feel like they are inclined and ready to share their own story. So I want to talk about ultimately how the idea for this podcast came about, this particular topic, and also discuss more or less what you can expect in terms of the focus over the course of time, although that, of course, may shift depending on what listeners want to hear and also what I begin to observe from those who come on the show and what they're wanting to express and what seems like the general direction that we collectively want to co-create this in, because I do view this as a co-creation. And that's one of the first things to say right out the gate is, yes, I am the host. Yes, I am the person producing this, but also this is a co-creation and this is a collective memoir of the feminine. And so we are doing this together. We are undertaking this journey together. And it is such an important journey, especially at this point in time in our world, that we do this together. Just a little bit about what prompted the idea for this particular podcast, this particular topic. As I said, the story of how I reclaimed my own voice, my own free will, and I'll say my own true expression, it is powerful. But I would wager that yours is too. I would wager that we all have really powerful stories of the voice and the aspects that shaped our experience to be what it has been in life. And what I've been realizing over the past handful of months is that, yes, my story is powerful, but we all have these common threads of hiding and of shadows and of illumination and ultimately for some of us, reclamation and what that looks like. And I'm going to tell mine today because I think it's only fair, as I said, and it's also foundational to the work that I'm doing now with the voice. But beyond today, I don't really feel so inclined to talk about it because I am embodying it. Right? It's how I'm being. It's not something I'm remembering to do in my mind. It's not something I'm checking off of a to-do list somewhere. It is quite literally how I am being. It's integrated now. And even just in the past couple of weeks, I stepped in further to this aspect of my integration. And that's why I'm able to show up for you today. That's why I'm able to overcome what I will call my very own visibility wound, which has been stretched the entire duration of my life up until just the last handful of months. And I feel so strongly about this mission that I'm showing up here today in front of this camera, talking to you about this very important topic. And my own work focuses directly a lot on embodied integration. And as a good friend said to me just a couple of weeks ago, when I was telling her that I didn't really feel so inclined to tell my story anymore, I know it's important. And it's interesting. I think for other people share that it's inspiring when I express what my walk has been. But my friend was saying it's a really beautiful thing when we don't need to tell our own story anymore. And instead we're able to use what we learned on our own journey in service to others, to uplift others, where we don't need to overtly say, oh, this is what happened to me and this was my experience, so on and so forth. And instead I can know in my heart and in my mind and in my whole being what my journey was and truly hold space for someone from that place of understanding and absolute empathy, right? And that is the spirit that I'm bringing to this podcast, right? Is when I sit across from another person and they're sharing their story and they're spilling their guts. And it really is such a vulnerable thing to talk about this particular journey because the voice it is who we are. It is who we are. It is our tool of diagnosis. It is our tool of self-knowledge and ultimately self-expression if we choose that. We don't all make the same choices. And that's what's fascinating. And that's one of the questions that this podcast will explore is why we choose what we choose. And what are the forces that prompt us to make those choices? And whether it is to express or not to express, whether it is to take up our space or to remain small. And I want to establish right now that there is no right answer to this, right? I think there are a lot of people out there that feel like the end goal of voice work is expression or sharing. I don't agree with that. I think there are some of us out there who really and truly do feel that it's enough that they just know who they are and they align their lives accordingly with what's true. This is voice work too. And that is enough. And maybe they don't feel compelled to do a live stream or do a, talking head reel on Instagram. And that doesn't mean that they have more shadow work to do. That means that they are simply embodying who they are. And it's using your voice also to say, no, that is not for me. No, thank you. This is also voice work. And so we'll explore ultimately not exactly what the manifestation of the choice is, but the choice itself, the fact that we have the choice, right? So this is a very important distinction to make here. And because I felt this shift in myself where no longer is my focus on telling my own story, and instead it's about using what I learned, using what I experienced in service to others. That's why I wanted to create this platform. That's why I wanted to hold this space. And there will be little bits and pieces that I share, I'm sure, in connection with those who come on the show, of course. But ultimately, I want to create space for someone else to come on, someone who is like I once was, where I felt like I had something I needed to say, but I didn't know where or to whom to say it. Right? So let's create that space together. Let's co-create that space for each other and be witnesses for each other, be compassionate witnesses for each other. That's what this is. Ultimately, what prompted this idea was actually an initiative that I ran for a very short while last summer. I think I started it in, I want to say August, maybe July or August of last year. And it ran for maybe 45 days. And it was called My Outside Voice. And it was something I ran almost exclusively on Instagram. And all it was basically it was my proposition that we co-create a virtual container that was a safe container for people to experiment with what it would be to use their voice in a way that they had thought that they wanted to, but maybe they didn't have the courage to do it on their own, right? And this was prompted by my hearing or receiving from friends their expression that, they wanted to do a live stream, but they didn't know how, or they felt afraid to do so, or they wanted to share a talking head reel, but it was intimidating, or they wanted to do, fill in the blank, run a Zoom teleconference or a Zoom webinar, but they'd never done that before, and it was scary, And so it got me thinking, like, what if we co-create a space online and just cheer each other on? right? It could be very simple. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. No, I called it a campaign, but it wasn't really a campaign. It was just, hey, like if you have something to share or something that's been on your mind or your heart to share, like let's hold space for each other. Ping me, tag me, and I will share it across my own platform and uplift you as best I can, right? So you're not doing it by yourself. And so this is an extension of that. But what is so interesting is after the campaign ended, I keep calling it a campaign, but I already clarified what it actually was. After this initiative ended and it wasn't really so much a focus anymore that I was posting about, there were a number of people that participated and they did some really cool things. They took a risk and so many of them came back to me and were like, thank you so much. That was really fun. That was just the nudge I needed, this kind of thing. There were others though, and this was fascinating to me. There were others that circled back around and they didn't participate, right? Which is fine. Like this was not a forced endeavor. Um, but, but they said to me, they said, I really wanted to in a lot of cases, I really, really wanted to. And it's still something I want to do, but I just couldn't. It was just too scary. I just couldn't. Right. And then there were some other reasons that came out as well. And this was fascinating to me. So it got me thinking, that it's really important that yes, we uplift those who do share and that we celebrate that, but also that we do some deep inquiry into what are the reasons why we don't share. And what can we do as a collective to help mediate the strength of those reasons so that if someone has something to say, something that they feel called to share, that they can do so and that they can do so in safety and with support, right? Or at least we can understand what are the reasons why we might choose not to share. And that's one thing that I really want to call out here is that this is not all about, like, of course, there are some aspects of using the voice that really are blissful, that really do feel like, for me at least, the ultimate realization of who I am as a human being and who I came here to be, right? I know that using the voice for me in this timeline is very, very important. And it's one of my callings, right? So I'm answering that call. Um, but I also think that it brings up so much shadow as well. It brings up so much baggage and so much fear. And as I mentioned earlier, it is so vulnerable. And so, of course, there are going to be some quote unquote dark sides to it as well. I don't actually care too much for like using the metaphor of light and dark. I think in wholeness, we all have both. We all have light and we all have darkness inside of us. And this is as it should be, right? One can't exist without the contrast of the other. However, I think, and the other part of this is it was underscored for me the importance of including constructive discussion and holding space for the shadow side of voice work when I attended a workshop last year in the springtime. And it was an online virtual workshop. It was like 6 weeks long. And it was kind of I can't remember exactly how it was characterized. Some kind of voice activation thing is the way it was described. And it was just a group of us coming together on Zoom and receiving the knowledge and the support of a woman who's an accomplished singer and works with the voice, right? And I think it was week 2. A woman spoke up and she said, I think this is great what you all are doing, and it's obvious you're really enjoying this. But for me, anytime I use my voice, there's so much heaviness that comes up and so much darkness and so much shadow. And I can't feel happy. I can't feel blissful the way that you all seem to. And it feels like this is not the space for me because this doesn't feel like a dialogue that could be included in what's currently happening in this workshop. And I remember going, oh my God, she's kind of right. Right. And that's not to say that it wouldn't have been welcome. Although I will say the way that this workshop was facilitated, it really was kind of just lighthearted. I don't want to use the word surface, but yeah, I'm going to use the word surface. Like it was kind of surface level. It wasn't really digging deep. And granted, we were in a virtual context. And I mean, there are reasons why we weren't really digging into the shadow aspect. It would have been maybe difficult to hold that kind of container in that way. Right. But she was right in that it was like, let's come together and enjoy the beauty of singing. And of course, that's wonderful. But also, let's also acknowledge that can bring some things up. It does bring things up. And let's make sure that we're holding space for that, and holding both lightly, and weighting them equally in terms of importance, right? Where we're not like, oh, okay, our focus is going to be on the light, but yeah, if the dark comes up, yeah, I guess we'll deal with it, right? No, no, no. Like, all of it is welcome. All of it is welcome. All of it has its place, an important place. And all of it is what is true. And that's why it has an important place. And so that got me thinking as well, that I really want this podcast to be a safe space for us to really have dialogue around what are some of the shadows of using the voice, particularly the feminine voice, particularly when we embody this feminine energy. And those of us that are female bodied, right? Expressing our voice. That's an additional layer of complexity in the world that we live in. Right. So holding space for that as well, and making sure that we are including dialogue that's honest and yeah, sometimes dark, but honest, true. What is true? So that we are all really creating a record that is real of what it is to use the voice, to amplify the voice of the feminine, to explore the reasons why we choose what we choose when it comes to using the voice. So this was ultimately the inception of this idea. And over the course of time, I've just met so many incredible human beings who were using the voice in various ways, whether they're singers or public speakers or teachers or writers or engaged in some aspect of advocacy work, right? For various populations that need our help. And so this podcast will feature people from all walks, and around using the voice, and how we make the choices that we do related to using the voice. And that brings me to the definition of the voice as it will be treated on this podcast. And that is, you may have already figured out, it's not just about singing, right? And voice work in general isn't, in my opinion. I work with a methodology that I created called remembered voice. And this is the voice of the body. Ultimately, this podcast is going to be focused on the voice as the metaphorical voice, how we use our voice to shape our lives, how we use the voice to exercise our free will in our lives. And so there will be people, of course, coming on here who are singers and who are wonderful singers, and people who are, wonderful public speakers. And these are very literal uses of the voice, right? But as I mentioned, also people coming on who are involved in advocacy of some kind, where it's using the voice to set boundaries or to advocate or to stand up for populations that can't do this for themselves. And this is also another very important aspect of using the voice. So, and ultimately, if I say someone is using their voice, they're taking up the space that's theirs. They're fully embodying their vessel to the fullest extent, to the most beautiful extent, and then living life from that place, living what is true for them. Or as my dad would say, voting with their feet. And I think the other piece of this is, and I mentioned earlier, not all of us want to express in the same way. And so using the voice, an example of using the voice could be choosing silence. Perhaps someone chooses not to express how they feel or not to participate in a particular way. And this is also using the voice in the sense that they are using their free will to determine their path. And so all of these will be held on equal ground. Whether a person chooses to sing or not to sing, whether a person chooses to express or not to express. This is kind of beside the point, and it's really more about the fact that we have the choice and what are the reasons why we choose what we choose, and the aspects of our story that lead us to make these choices the way that we do. And my hope is that even if someone chooses something different, probably we will still see ourselves reflected in some way in the story that they tell of the voice. And so it will bring us closer, even if ultimately the path that we choose is different. And so with that said, I would like to talk about my own journey. I'll share a little bit about what my walk has been, just so you understand more about the person who's hosting this and more about the kind of space that I want to create and the reasons why I think it's so important to hold these kinds of spaces. I've already given you sort of more intellectual reasons, but now I'm going to speak to you from the heart about my own heart and about my own path of the voice. My remembrance, actually, is the best word. of my own voice and of my own autonomy and my own expression and my own free will. And so currently I am working as a somatic voice and sound practitioner, based primarily in Portugal, but also from the United States originally. And if you would have told me where I would be in my life just 3 years ago, I would have told you were stark raving mad. I would have told you that you were crazy. Because at that point in time, I was working in software development. I was in a 7-year relationship that had been done for a very long time, but neither of us had had the courage to call it. I was living in the same community I'd been in for 5 years, which was a nice community, but it was one that I'd always told myself was temporary and wasn't where I was going to put down roots. But I hadn't made any plans to make a shift because I was just mostly living in quiet desperation in my life. I was numb from the neck down. I hated my body. I wasn't comfortable in space. I was not singing. Most importantly, I was not singing, and I was in an expressive silence that had lasted for about 20 years. And this is the piece that is so important is for most of my life up until the time when I was 20 or 21, I was very musical. I was very involved in aspects of the voice and playing instruments. But I think it's really important to call out that it never really felt like mine. It always was performative. It was for a concert or for a recital or for church or for someone other than me. And it was someone else's music too. I wasn't writing my own. I didn't trust myself to improvise, because so much of improvisation is about listening and trusting, and it's about being connected inside such that you can respond to what you feel on the outside, right? And so I wasn't doing any of this, but I did have this foundational sort of element and this foundational layer of technique and training and an understanding and a learning of music, like a knowledge of music, that was for the first 20 years. I also was incredibly involved in writing. And actually creative writing was probably one of my first loves in terms of expression. And even before I could write actual words, I would write stories, and they would just be scribble on paper. But I was writing stories, and then I would go to the kitchen and I'd read them to my mom as she's cooking dinner. I could never read the same story twice, of course, because it was just gibberish on the paper, but I was writing stories when I was very, very young. And I remember when I finally did get to the point where I could write, I would lock myself in a closet and just write for hours, right? And just be off in this fantasy world that I created with my words and with my imagination and with my expression. And I can also remember acting out fantasies of being a famous author. I think there was a part of me that dreamed of someday writing a book, of someday sharing these words that were so near and dear to my heart. And I would light a candle and then write by candlelight into the wee hours of the morning, pretending that I was an author from hundreds of years ago, and that I was, in these dire straits, dark times, quite literally, and writing by candlelight. And so it was such an important part of how I grew up, and such an important part of who I was. And by the time I was in junior high, I was published as a story writer in a couple of different publications, and they were just local publications. And then I had my poetry published in high school. There was an English teacher who took an essay that I had written one year in his class. I basically had deviated from his assignment. I ticked all the boxes on the syllabus, but ultimately, I had chosen to entertain myself a bit more and had created a story out of an essay requirement. And he used that as an exemplar for the next year. So I definitely had a knack for writing. It was a skill, and it was a love. It was one of my deepest loves, and it was a direct portal to who I was. But meanwhile, there was a shadow side to this, in that I had a visibility wound, right? And because I was accomplished, people had high expectations, and those expectations terrified me. And I did everything I could to avoid those expectations, to the extent that I would skip class. I would not show up for appointments. I would underperform on purpose on assignments to keep expectations managed so that I didn't have so much pressure. And at the time, I didn't do that consciously, right? But in looking back, now I know that that's what I was doing. I was trying to manage expectations that felt absolutely overwhelming. And I was the kind of kid where, if I was in front of people at church, I'd be having a panic attack while trying to play flute, which doesn't work very well because you have to breathe when you play. And I would have panic attacks when I would need to sing, which also doesn't work because you have to breathe to sing. And so in general, I was an incredibly sensitive kid, afflicted with all of the clairs, as I say, clairvoyancy, clairaudience, all these things, all of the clairs. And so when I would be playing music for people, it wasn't just that I was playing the music, I was also receiving the input of their perceptions and feeling them, experiencing my music. And it was too much. It was too much for me. And so for me, the performance anxiety went much deeper than I would say like a more neurotypical person, because I felt everything and I felt everything so, so, so deeply and took it so, so, so personally. And because my expression in terms of music, especially, was performative, it was for the purpose of achieving a particular objective, whether that was to play a song for the offertory at church or to complete a piece for a recital. Once again, as I said, it never felt like mine, and it was somebody else's music. And so because my sharing of music was contingent on the perception of the other, that made it a very fragile, delicate kind of expression where I didn't really derive any satisfaction from it if I was just by myself. I remember loving playing, but I would play the same pieces over and over again because I had no tolerance for making a mistake. God forbid I not play a piece, even by myself, perfectly, right? And so practicing, whenever I was taking lessons, practicing was always nightmarish for me because, of course, you're making mistakes when you're practicing. You're learning, and we learn by making mistakes. But I had no self-compassion for myself. I had the highest standards, and I was harder on myself, the most rigorous, strictest, most critical judge of myself. I didn't grow up in a household where either of my parents was watching over me, critiquing me, and criticizing me for being imperfect. In fact, both of them were very encouraging. Both of them are high performers themselves, but both of them towards me outwardly were very encouraging and very supportive and showed up for me in ways that most parents don't for their kids. And so I had a lot of support at home, but towards myself, I could not show kindness towards myself. And so this kind of created the perfect storm, such that when I was in a relationship in my early 20s, I got with this guy who was very, very threatened by the fact that I had such a strong foundation for expression and that I had such a vibrant creative life before him. And at the time when we started dating, I had about 7 years worth of poems and stories and songs and just various kinds of written expression that were on my computer. And he always had a problem with that. He was always threatened by this. This is an example of someone who really needed me to be small for him to feel okay. And at the time, I thought I loved him so much. I had convinced myself that he was the one. And so I did shrink for him. I did make myself small. I made myself not completely small, but as in I still retained a little bit of autonomy, but I did shrink to make him feel better. I have to admit that. I did shrink. I did compromise the space that I was taking up. And there was one day we had lots of fights about these poems and these stories that were on my computer, and he felt like it was unhealthy for me to still have them. And I had told him that it was just like a written record of my life, and what had been important to me at certain points in time and certain reflections that were really priceless and really precious to me and really important parts of my experience as a human being, especially during my teenage years and my early college years, just really precious memories and really precious reflections. But he was still very threatened. And there was one day when he took my computer to Best Buy because it was malfunctioning. It was actually having technical issues. And so I remember, like it was yesterday, when I went to pick him up at the apartment that we shared, and we
made a little trip to 7-Eleven. We were just going to go pick up a Slurpee or pick up, I don't know, a beverage of some kind or something. We were just making a little errand. And I asked him in passing about the computer. I said, "Oh, were they able to fix the computer? Did everything go okay?" And he said, "Yeah, it's fine now. They wiped the hard drive." And I remember we were parked already in front of 7-Eleven, and I remember how everything seemed to slow down. And I asked him, but I already knew the answer. I said, "Well, what about my stories?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, they're probably gone. Yeah, they're gone, but you needed to let those go anyway." And I was like, and I remember, I still feel it now. I'm actually getting chills right now. I remember the physical sensation of something inside of me breaking. And I'm not going to say it was my heart, but it was something snapping, right? And this relationship up until this point had been very tumultuous and traumatic for me. It was not a healthy relationship. It was in fact abusive in some very classic ways. But I had stayed, and it goes to show how precious this part of me and my experience was, that was the moment when he lost me definitively. And I remember thinking to myself, we're done. We're done. And I also still remember looking ahead and seeing the 7-Eleven logo, and just my eyes were just fixated on it, and I was just frozen, and he got out and he went inside and he went and got whatever he was going to get, and I just remember thinking, we're done. We're done. And that was the point at which I started plotting my escape. And it really was an escape because it was an abusive situation. But it took me losing my stories and in a sense, my voice from the prior 7 years, to make me make that move, right? Where it became clear that I couldn't take up space in any way, not even in the past tense, in that relationship. What happened then at that point is, because in the sharing of those stories and in his knowledge of, his witnessing of the stories, that was what had created the lack of safety. I stopped writing. I stopped expressing. And I had already been, as I've said, I had already been a very harsh judge of myself. And I had already been entering a sort of silence at that point in my life because of this harsh sort of criticism that I would impose on myself. But that was the last straw. That sent me into a silence, an expressive silence that only intensified as time went on. And I did manage to extricate myself from that relationship, obviously, because here I am. But I also, it took me 20 years to return to sharing my voice and sharing music. And during that time, it's really fascinating. For a period of time, maybe up until about a year ago, I viewed myself as sort of a victim, right? Like where I really berated myself, once again, the self-criticism for not having broken out of it sooner. Even though I cognitively could understand why I hadn't, you know. I felt like I lost all that time, that I wasted all those years. And then it occurred to me that no, in fact, it was a very important incubator. It was a very important incubator. And in fact, during the period of time when I was growing up, so for the first about 20 years, I was embodying the playing of music and the sharing of music and the sharing of my voice in various ways, whether it was through writing or whether it was through singing or what have you. I was embodying it, but I wasn't. It wasn't inside, right? It wasn't like an intrinsic thing. It wasn't something that felt like mine. And I was very much kind of a head case about it, right? Very anxious, lots of performance anxiety, lots of insecurity, lots of self-doubt. And in that sense, it wasn't like my authentic expression in any way, shape, or form, right? Because I didn't know how to create that kind of safety for myself at that point. And then I entered this expressive silence after that event that happened with my ex-boyfriend, where he deleted all of my work, where there were so many funny elements now that I look back. I carried a piano with myself everywhere I went, which, pianos aren't like a harmonica. They're not lightweight. They're not easy to carry, especially not back then. A digital piano, I had a Korg digital piano in the early 2000s. It probably weighed 200 pounds. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but it was heavy. and, and I remember, carrying it up, well, helping my brother and my dad, bless them, carry it up the stairs to my apartment in Chicago. And I hardly played that thing. I couldn't bring myself to play it. I couldn't bring myself to sing, such that where I would hear myself. I would wear headphones, not so I could hear myself, but so I couldn't. And this is how strict I was. This is how hard I was on myself. And I couldn't stand to play the piano because, God forbid, I would make a mistake because I hadn't practiced in a really long time. And the only exception to that was shortly after that relationship, I underwent trauma therapy, and playing the scales on the piano up and down, up and down, up and down for hours on end were one of the only things that comforted me because it was so measured and it was rhythmic. And there's science that goes into that. That's not for this particular podcast, but that was really the only exception was music, for therapeutic purposes. I also got into therapeutic drumming when I went through a divorce a handful of years later. But once again, it wasn't expressive. It was very formulaic. It was West African drumming. And so you played the polyrhythm according to, the way that it was written so that it would fit in with the other rhythms, right? It was very important to play it the way that it was prescribed. So, and I hated soloing. I wouldn't solo, right? So that's why I say it was an expressive silence. I also got into chanting around this time and, probably in my mid 20s. So about 20 years ago now. And once again, these are really powerful mantras. And they can be very expressive. They can be very sort of individualized and from the heart. But for me, they were from the heart, but they were still very tentative. And they still felt like they belonged to someone else. And I was still very careful to follow only the words and not to take any liberties. And I still didn't really like chanting when it was just me. I wanted to chant with others where I couldn't hear the sound of my own voice so much. So I still was afraid of the sound of my own voice. And the other aspect that I think is fascinating, and I see this a lot with others who are recovering creatively, is I was what you would call a shadow artist, in that I knew I was creative deep down. I knew that I had this expressiveness that needed to find a way out of me. But because I wasn't yet ready to pull that part of myself out of shadow, it was my hidden gold that I had buried deep beneath all of these layers. Instead, Carl Jung talks about how we give our gold to someone else to carry for a little while when we're not ready to integrate it into how we are being in our lives. And so I dated musicians. I was very close friends with artists. I was always around artists and musicians. But I did not embody these qualities myself. Right. So they were carrying my hidden gold for me. I was drawn to them because inside of me, deep down, what they were embodying was also a part of who I was, but I wasn't ready to fully claim it yet. And that's why I say this time was a very important incubator, because I was exposed to all these powerful influences, all of these interesting ways of being and doing. And I had other experiences that gave me massive amounts of, I'll call it wisdom, right? It was a very difficult period of time for me as well, because I was embodying silence in all the ways that mattered, I drew into my experience jobs, partners, friendships, and other experiences that benefited from that silence. Or I'm even going to go so far as to say they were predicated on that silence. They depended on my silence to be successful or to last. And that was especially true with regard to relationships, where I would accept a relationship situation that required me to be smaller, because I was already making myself small. So it was familiar, and it felt, in fact, safe to my nervous system, which I had trained long ago, that to align with the notion that to be small was the only way to remain safe, to remain hidden, to hide the most important parts of myself was the only way to remain safe. And so partners who needed me to be small and to be quiet and not to express in the ways that felt important to me felt the most safe. Does this make sense? So, and that obviously was a problem once I started to come out of my shell, once I started to express again, and started to take up the space that was rightfully mine. Then that became an issue, right? And then as Carl Jung talks about, the power distribution, once we are ready to reintegrate our gold and we're ready to start taking back our gold from those who we have asked to carry it for us, the power distribution changes. And then, I'm embodying what is rightfully mine. I'm just reintegrating these parts of myself that I had been separate from, that I had hidden. But to the other person, I'm taking up a lot more space and I'm embodying a lot more power more overtly, just in terms of who I am. Not that I'm pushing anybody around or behaving in any kind of way that's truly problematic, other than the fact that I am taking up the space that's mine and using my voice to shape my experience. So that in and of itself can cause problems for relationship dynamics, whether it's a friendship or a romantic partnership that's predicated on one person being silent and being small. Of course, it's going to cause problems. And so having had all of these experiences with what it is to shrink and what it is to go through life in that way, knowing what I carried inside, that was the other part of it. Was, I embodied music for the first 20 years of my life, and then carried a piano around, and I was a shadow artist, and I was chanting, and I was drumming, and I was doing all these things. I was kind of going through the motions, but I wasn't really fully embodying it and fully claiming it as part of who I was. But in terms of the voice, in terms of singing, in terms of public speaking, in terms of teaching the way that I know I can teach, all of these things, I daydreamed about it constantly. Every day, I daydreamed about it. And it felt like something that was completely impossible and outside of myself, and completely ridiculous. And I would put my headphones on. I was by myself for a lot of the time. I was very solitary during these years. And I still am. I'm a bit that way no matter what. But I was very solitary during these years. And I remember I would put my headphones on and I would belt at the top of my voice with the headphones also turned way up so I couldn't hear myself, and pretend that I was sharing my voice in the way that I felt like I could share it. Not necessarily on a stage, but just sharing it so other people could witness it, so they could hear it, and so I could feel it and claim it. And so every day for decades, I dreamed about it, but it was my secret dream, and it was also my secret fear. And then finally, I was in this, as I said, I was in this 7-year-long relationship that had been done for a long time, but neither of us wanted to really make the first move to end it. And I'm sure he would say the same. So I feel comfortable saying that out loud here. Um, I decided that I was tired of hating my body. I was tired of feeling self-conscious about dance and about moving and about being witnessed, just moving in space. And so I decided that was going to be the first thing that I tackled in terms of regaining my self-expression. And it it knowing how much I hated my body at that point in time, and knowing how terrified I was to be witnessed dancing, it kind of blows my mind now that I think about it, that I did what I did. And so in late 2022, I'd heard about ecstatic dance, and I had researched it kind of extensively. And I was like, it looks terrifying, but also I feel like this could maybe do the trick. This could maybe help me release myself. I was just thinking in terms of the movement, right? In terms of the dance, and in terms of my self-perception of my body. Like, I had actual body dysmorphia at this point in my life, and was really suffering because of it in so many different regards. I was, as I said, numb from the neck down, um, and just very disembodied, very disconnected from myself and from my body. And so I decided it's go big or go home. And so I registered for an ecstatic dance retreat in Portugal, never having been to Europe, never having been to a single ecstatic dance, never having attended an ecstatic dance retreat, certainly not. And I went big. I was like, let's do this. And So now I would describe that as what in my work I call encoding, where there was like a part of me that knew that it was time to unlock. There was a part of me, and I describe now where it's like a great big hand just reached down and grabbed me out of my life and like threw me down onto a different continent. That's still how it feels sometimes. Um, and so I went to this ecstatic dance retreat that following March in 2023, and kind of predictably, it blew my world wide open, right? I re-encountered parts of myself, the parts of myself that I had hidden so long before. Way before the 20-year expressive silence began, right? Like I feel like I encountered parts of myself that I had not witnessed or experienced since early childhood. And I did actually during a trance dance reconnect with my own inner child, and I saw the face of myself as a child, and we went for a walk together in the woods and had a little talk and had a little dance. And I touched what I would now describe as wholeness within myself for the first time in decades. What made all the difference was I didn't let that felt sense of wholeness die upon returning to daily life. And that's why my work focuses on embodied integration now, because my own integration, my own intentional integration led to my eventual transformation. And what's so fascinating is using the channel of the body to reconnect to this place of wholeness again and again, because I kept dancing. I danced every single day after I returned from this retreat. And just making one different decision when presented with the same set of options let me slowly shift my life. And slowly, things that were not aligned started to fall away. And because I was reconnecting with this part of myself that was my authentic expression, over time, I got braver, and I got brave enough to try using my voice again. And this time, it was my voice. This time, it was mine. This time, it was my expression. And this time, it was a reflection of what was true for me. And the very first song that I composed was on August 8th, 2023, in Portugal, which is a very spiritually powerful place for me, because that's where the ecstatic dance retreat was. And then that was also where I had returned in the month of August that year to stay for a month. And because I felt a pull, I felt the call to return. And that was where I composed my first song, we'll call it. And from there, bit by bit, I came back into full embodiment, full ownership of my voice. And what was so fascinating was as I developed my relationship with my voice, I mean, this is the relationship with the self, right? And as my self-compassion grew, my voice got stronger, metaphorically and literally. And I decided I wanted to go to school for therapeutic voice. And so I did that. I mean, there were a number of other sort of educational experiences that I decided to pursue in somatics and in sound and in voice, because I realized that I had this lived experience. And I wanted to complement that with credentials and with learning, with formal learning experiences that would really position me to be supportive for others. Because I knew that, you know, I don't believe that any of us goes through these kinds of experiences, and without there being greater purpose to it. And although I didn't really talk about my journey at the time that I was undergoing it, like the most intense parts of it, I kept completely to myself. I more or less dropped out of life. I disappeared. And there were a lot of people that made assumptions about that and took advantage of the fact that I was gone to weave all kinds of crazy stories about, what I was doing or what I wasn't doing or the kind of person that I was for just disappearing. And what I was doing was healing. What I was doing was letting my nervous system reset from decades of relationships that had asked me to be small and had been very traumatizing for me as a sensitive human. But most of all, I was on a journey to remember, based on the premise that, one of my favorite teachers talks about how we all come into this world knowing who we are. And we start out in spirit form, sort of drifting around somewhere out there. And then we come to this earth and we're given a suit. And for a while, we remember what that suit contains, but over time we forget. Over time, we layer on personalities and defense mechanisms and all of these other things, all of these other egoic notions of who we need to be accepted in life. And over time, we forget. And then something happens. In my case, it was an ecstatic dance retreat. And suddenly we remember, or we have a glimpse of what the suit contains. And then we set out, he said, on what could be called a journey to remember. And that is exactly what happened to me in my voice. And it changed my life. And so now I use my voice every single day, and I work with groups facilitating. I work with individuals one-on-one who are seeking to remember these parts of themselves and reintegrate their voice into their own lives. I facilitate sound experiences. I'm able to become increasingly creative with sound and collaborating in different ways with people across different disciplines. And as a multimedia artist, of course, I have all kinds of crazy ideas that now I have the means of putting them into motion and making them come to fruition. I am working with clients one-on-one, helping them with embodied integration if someone is going through a heavy transition or has just experienced a transformative moment or insight at an event, and they're wanting to keep that insight alive in daily life. I work with them to help them connect with all aspects of the self, the whole body, the whole being, to keep that insight alive for long enough that it reaches the point of full embodiment, such that it's a way they are being and not something they're doing. I am this fall going to be co-producing an EP of my songs that I wrote over the past 3 years of my own journey of the voice. And that feels like something that isn't real yet, but it is real. It is happening. And so it really is a dream come true. And I also am living abroad. This is a dream I've had for a couple of decades, and I never acted on it until recently. I dance on the regular. I used to hate my body. I used to hate moving my body in space. I used to barely be able to look at myself in the mirror. And now I dance all the time, freely and with abandon and with joy in my heart and fully embodying my vessels. Once I learned what was in there, and once I came into an understanding of what was waiting to be expressed, and I had the depth of all of those years of silence to reinforce that expression, where if I share a song or if I share my voice, it is imbued with that feeling, and it's a release of sorts. It has the frequency of release such that now if I share sound or if I share my voice, other people also have significant releases. And I think so much of it is about what I'm embodying, what we are collectively co-creating, is this permission to release, this permission to just be exactly as we are without all the layers. This is the invitation. This is the ask. This is what life asks of us. And without all of the adornment. And everyone, I believe, has something that calls them. And it's a matter of, are we willing to risk the life that we've been living for the one that calls us? And I think that there are certain things that happen in all of our lives that ultimately we arrive at a point where the answer to that question is yes, definitively yes. And in my case, that's what happened in 2023. I was asked the question, are you willing to risk the life that you've been living for the one that you are called to live? And I said yes. And that has been the making of me. It has been some of the toughest years of my life. But as I have shed the layers that are not me, I have remembered who I am and what I am meant to step into in this timeline. And part of that is holding spaces like this one. Part of that is holding spaces like this podcast, and creating opportunities and invitations for others who also feel the call, who also feel the pull, but need somewhere to be witnessed safely and with compassion and with empathy. And so that's what this is. And so ultimately, the thing to call out here is that when I finally arrived at the point where I was willing to say yes to that question, then the embodiment, the physical embodiment of music and of voice and of expression that had characterized the first 20 years of my life was collapsed in with the next 20 years where I wasn't embodying it. I wasn't claiming these parts of myself on the outside in any way, shape, or form, but I was thinking about it and I was dreaming of it and I was visualizing it. And my heart and my soul were very much engaging with this part of myself, such that when I finally said yes, just 3 years ago, to the call, when I finally said yes in response to the question, are you willing to risk the life that you've been living for the one that calls you, for the one that you could be living? And I finally said yes, the whole universe rose to meet me because I said yes, and then I took steps in the direction of that dream. I took steps in the direction of that embodiment. I laid claim to these parts of myself, and the universe rose up to meet me. And that is what I want to emphasize here, is that this was not personal to me. What happened for me is archetypical in that it could happen for anyone. It could happen for any of us when we say yes to what calls us, when we say yes to the full embodiment of who we are meant to be, who we are called to be. When we say yes to using our voice the way that we are called to use it. This is how it works. This is how it works for all of us. It wasn't specific to me. And so in that sense, time kind of collapsed and things started to move so quickly. And this is how I was able to move to Portugal. This is how I was able to step into a role working as the lead researcher in collaboration with the university to initiate a therapeutic sound research center in Europe, of all places. So many dreams of mine have come true because I said yes and because I started to just move in that direction. And this is a process I call following the thread, where I didn't have any idea where I would wind up, but I just tried to keep making the next right decision and kept trying to trust in the direction that my feet were taking me. Trusting that if I was making the right decision, that would lead to another right decision. And I couldn't help but wind up in the right place. And that's how it unfolded. And so I really am living the life of my dreams. And once again, I want to emphasize, it's not personal to me, it's archetypical. You, if you're listening to this, can do it too. That's how my own journey with the voice informs what this podcast will be. And that's how my own journey with the voice informs what the rest of my life will consist of. Because this is not just something that's a frivolous, idea that I think would be fun. This is part of my life's work. Is holding these kinds of spaces and advocating for anyone who feels like they are ready to take a step further into who they are, to explore their internal landscape. This is the invitation. And I think all of us, when we learn about each other's stories and we learn what we are each able to do, capable of doing, the path that has brought us to where we are, we realize that anything really is possible, that what you dream of is possible for you. It may not be easy, but ultimately, the more you step into using the voice to shape your life the way that you know it's meant to be shaped, the more you call in what is actually for you. And the clearer your way becomes. There have been moments of true clarity on this journey where I've realized that I am absolutely in alignment with this path, even though it's not easy, even though in some ways, because the ask is so significant now for me. Like I mentioned before, I've always been afraid of expectations. That's been part of the visibility wound for all this time. Now, with what I'm stepping into, there are going to be some big expectations. And so in a way, it's confronting one of my worst fears. But it's worth it. and I'm answering the call. And that's part of this work as well. That's part of this work with the voice. So this is what's driving this. This is what's driving the podcast. I'm so excited and I feel so honored and so blessed to be in a position in my life to be able to facilitate this and to be able to co-create this with you all. And I hope that there's some aspect of the story that I've told that resonates with you. I invite you to reach out to me, share with me your own story, share with me your own thoughts or your own reflections if you feel called. I really want this to be an exchange, and it's just a jumping off point. Who knows where we will go from here? But ultimately, it's all about how are we uplifting and holding space for each other. And I think now more than ever, we are collectively called to step into this power, to step into the power of leading with the feminine, strength and softness. The voice is very, very strong, but it comes from such a soft place. It comes from the heart. It comes from the heart. So in making this offering, this invitation, this is coming from my heart to yours. And it is an honor. So sending you so much love wherever you are, wherever you're listening from. Thank you so much for holding space for me to share these words. And we will be kicking off the first interview in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, thank you so much. Sending so many blessings. And until next time.
Tune in next time for an interview with our very first guest and another deep dive into how we use the feminine voice to shape our lives and the forces that affect that choice.
Esta es mi voz. This is her outside voice.